Welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're traveling back in time to 1960s Zambia.
Ooh, Zambia. Love it. What's on the docket for today's deep dive?
Well, imagine a country fresh out of colonial rule, right? They're trying to figure out how to blend their traditions into this brand new legal system. It's a recipe for some really interesting legal battles.
I can only imagine. You know, those early years post-colonialism, so much upheaval. What kind of case are we talking about?
That's where Kaniki v. Jairus comes in. It's a case that still has legal scholars scratching their heads.
Okay, Kaniki v. Jairus, got it. And what's so special about this case? I'm intrigued.
The best part is we've got our hands on the actual court documents.
Oh, wow. Primary sources. You really went all out for this one. I'm ready. Let's dive in.
So the case is basically this. You have Jairus, a brother-in-law, who decides to sue Kaniki, his deceased brother's widow.
Okay, already sounds like a messy family affair. What's the lawsuit about?
Well, he's suing for compensation after his brother's death. Seems straightforward, right?
I've got a feeling there's more to it than meets the eye. What's the catch?
The catch is something called the Akamutwe custom. It's a tradition from the Lala tribe.
Akamutwe. Interesting. I've studied a bit about African customary law, but I can't say I'm familiar with that specific one.
It gets pretty fascinating. Have you ever come across it in your research?
You know, what always gets me is how much variety exists within even one country's customs. And it looks like this case touches on that, right?
You hit the nail on the head. It's not as cut and dry as one country, one custom. The judgment actually talks about how Akamutwe plays out in all these different ways across various Zambian tribes. It really highlights the challenges courts face.
Absolutely. Trying to create a unified legal system when you have such a diverse tapestry of customs can't be easy.
Yeah.
So what does Akamutwe actually entail? Give me the rundown.
So Jairus is arguing that, according to Akamutwe, Kaniki's family owed his family money because her husband, his brother, died.
So it's like an inheritance thing, but with a customary twist.
Kind of. The judgment talks about how some people believe this custom is rooted in the idea that, the surviving spouse is actually responsible for their partner's death.
Whoa, hold on. You mean like they're being blamed for it?
Well, yeah. Or that a payment is needed to free their spirit so they can remarry.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
Yeah.
You lose your spouse and then you're slapped with a fine because of these spiritual beliefs.
It's a lot, which is precisely where this case gets interesting.
Okay, now I'm really hooked. So where did this case even start?
Well, it went to the Shabila Native Court, a lower court. They ruled in favor of Jairus.
Which makes sense, I guess. Back then, these lower courts were often bound by traditional law, weren't they?
Exactly. But it didn't end there. Kaniki, she wasn't going down without a fight.
I wouldn't either, especially after that ruling. What did she do?
She appealed. Her argument was that the amount she was ordered to pay, it was just way too high.
Fair enough. I mean, it's one thing to uphold a custom, but the financial burden shouldn't be crippling. So what happened with the appeal?
This is where it gets really interesting. The resident magistrate, the one handling the appeal, took it a step further.
Oh, how so? They didn't just rubber stamp the lower court's decision?
Not at all. They decided to examine the validity of this whole Akamutwe thing.
Wow, they really opened up a can of worms with that one.
Right. It's not just about the money anymore. Now it's about questioning the custom itself.
Bold move. So what was the magistrate's verdict on this Akamutwe custom?
The magistrate actually ended up concluding that forcing a widow to pay because of some, spiritual debt, that it violated natural justice.
Natural justice. I imagine that became a pretty important concept in these kinds of cases.
Oh, absolutely. Think of it like a legal safety net woven into the system to protect against customs that are just downright unfair or oppressive.
Makes sense. So the magistrate basically said, nope, this custom doesn't fly with the principles of natural justice.
Exactly. But there's a but, a big but.
Uh-oh. There's always a but, isn't there? What's the catch this time?
The magistrate, in reaching this decision, they lean on a government circular.
A government circular? Wait a minute. Was that even admissible evidence? Seems like something you'd find left on a car windshield, not something to challenge centuries of tradition in court?
Right. That's a great point. And that's where it gets interesting legally speaking.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What happened next?
The judgment really digs into this whole issue of the hierarchy of legal sources.
Ah, the nitty-gritty of legal technicalities. I'm all ears.
So it turns out a loan circular, especially without proper authentication, it doesn't really hold much weight in a court of law.
Oh, boy. Sounds like the magistrate's heart was in the right place trying to protect Kaniki, but they stumbled on a legal technicality.
Exactly. You've got it.
What a mess. So what happened? Did the whole case just crumble? Yeah, exactly. This is where it takes a turn you might not expect.
Okay, now you've got me on the edge of my seat. What happened? Did they send it back to the lower court and make them start from scratch?
They didn't. Instead, the High Court decided they'd just rule on the case themselves.
Mm.
And, well, that's what makes Kaniki v. Jairus such a landmark legal case in Zambia.
Wow. So even though the magistrate messed up with the whole evidence thing, the High Court still thought the issues in the case were too important to ignore.
Exactly. They were in a tricky position.
I bet. Trying to respect the legal process, but also wanting to make sure justice was served.
Yeah, they were walking a tightrope, that's for sure. They basically said, we see what you did there, magistrate, but we also see the potential injustice of this whole Akamutwe custom.
This case just keeps getting more and more interesting. It really shows the struggles that many countries faced after shaking off colonial rule.
Totally. Trying to create a justice system that respects both tradition and modern legal ideas. Not easy.
Not easy at all. So what did the High Court ultimately decide in Kaniki v. Jairus? Did they side with Kaniki?
They didn't completely overturn what the lower court decided, but they did something very interesting. Their judgment was like shining a bright spotlight on customs like this Akamutwe business.
Yeah, okay, I see where you're going with this. It's like they were saying, hey, we get that tradition is important, but not when it steps all over people's rights.
That's a great way to put it, and that's huge EE, right? And it set a powerful precedent. It's basically saying that courts can and should take a hard look at these old customs and decide if they're still fair in the modern world.
Wow, and to think it all started with a dispute about a fine in a small court in Zambia. Do we have any juicy details from the judgment itself? What was their reasoning?
Oh, absolutely. There's this great line in the judgment. They talk about how their goal is to uphold substantial justice without undue regard to technicalities.
Substantial justice without undue regard to technicalities.
Man, legal language can be so dense sometimes, even when it's trying to be clear. What does that even mean? Yeah, it sounds like something you'd read in a law textbook. Essentially, they were saying they weren't going to get bogged down in every little procedural misstep. What mattered most to them was making sure things were fair.
So they were trying to follow the spirit of the law, even if the letter of the law wasn't perfectly followed.
Exactly. And that's why this case, Kaniki v. Jairus, is still cited today by lawyers and legal scholars.
Wow, a case from 1960s Zambia still relevant today? That blows my mind a little bit.
It really shows how law is always evolving. It's not just some dusty old set of rules. It has to adapt as society changes.
Absolutely. What seems perfectly acceptable in one era might be considered completely outrageous a few decades later.
Right, and this case is a perfect example of that. What starts as a seemingly straightforward inheritance dispute
Turns into a major legal showdown that ends up questioning the very foundation of a centuries-old custom.
and forces everyone to grapple with what justice really means.
It's easy to get lost in all the legal back and forth, but we've got to remember that this case is about real people.
Right. At the heart of it all, you have a widow grieving over the loss of her husband.
Exactly. And then she's thrown into this crazy legal battle over a tradition that seems so unfair.
It's a good reminder that these legal decisions, they have real human consequences.
Absolutely. And speaking of human consequences, the judgment itself, it kind of acknowledges this.
Oh, how so?
It talks about how sensitive death and remarriage are in Zambian culture.
Right. It's not just some abstract legal concept. These customs are deeply intertwined with people's lives, their beliefs.
It really feels like this whole case, it's a snapshot of a society in transition, don't you think? Trying to figure out how to hold on to its past while also moving into the future.
100%. It makes you question everything. Like, what do we hold on to simply because it's tradition?
And what do we toss out because it doesn't hold up anymore? Where do we draw that line between tradition and what's actually right?
It's the question, isn't it? And Kaniki v. Jairus, it really embodies that struggle.
It does. Because it's not just about some dusty old law books and courtroom arguments. This case is a glimpse into a defining moment for Zambia as a nation, figuring out its identity in this post-colonial world.
Exactly. And it also shines a light on the massive responsibility that courts have in all of this.
It's not just about interpreting the law. They're interpreting justice itself, which is a pretty weighty task if you think about it.
No kidding.
Huh.
And what they decide, it shapes how a nation sees itself.
And how it moves forward. Which brings us back to that key takeaway from Kaniki v. Jairus. Justice, well, it's rarely black and white, is it?
Hardly ever. There's a lot of gray areas, a lot of nuance. You have to consider cultural contexts, weigh the different interests.
It's complicated.
Vary. And sometimes it means questioning beliefs that have been around for centuries.
It reminds me of that saying, easy cases make bad law, or something like that.
There you go. Because this case, Kaniki v. Jairus, it was anything BDT easy.
No kidding. It forced the court to confront some really, really complex issues.
And in doing so, they ended up establishing a precedent that still has a ripple effect today. Not just in Zambia, but for anyone trying to figure out where custom ends and the law begins.
It's incredible, really. This whole deep dive has been amazing. We've explored how law, culture, and history all intertwine.
And how a single legal battle, even one from decades ago, can spark such important conversations.
Exactly. Kaniki v. Jairus reminds us that the quest for justice never really ends. It's a journey.
It is, and it requires constant reflection, a willingness to challenge what we think we know, even if it makes us a little uncomfortable.
And on that note, as you go about your day, think about this. What are some customs you've always just accepted as the way things are?
I like that. Could those customs, viewed through a different lens, maybe raise some eyebrows? Could they spark a debate about fairness or justice?
It's something to ponder, right? That's what these deep dives are all about, to make us question our assumptions and hopefully learn something new along the way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's the beauty of a good deep dive. It pushes us out of our comfort zones, helps us see things from new perspectives.
And in the end, it makes us a little bit wiser about the world around us.
Exactly.